So I'm David Schlosberg. I'm a professor of environmental politics here at the University of Sydney. I'm also the director of the Sydney Network on Climate Change and Society. And it's that network that is putting together this particular symposium. My own presentation had to do with looking at new types of environmental movements and trying to figure out ways of analyzing those movements. There are a number of new types of environmental movements that don't really fit the frameworks, the existing frameworks of analysis that we have in either environmental politics or social movement analysis. So I'm looking at food movements, food justice movements, food sovereignty movements on the one hand, new energy movements, just transition, transition towns, energy descent, and then I'm looking at crafting and making movements as well. And all of these movements are very interested in material processes, in the way that we use materials, the way that materials flow through our bodies, for example, with food, the way that we produce energy and what happens to that. So I'm looking at these movements and trying to analyze them in terms of their resistance to power, and movements are very interested in removing themselves from participation in, say, industrialized food systems or in energy systems that they see as polluting the planet and causing climate change. I'm looking at these movements also in terms of the way that it's not just about resistance to power, it's about trying to redesign the way that human beings interact with the natural world. So in paying attention to material, it's not just about power and doing something on one's own, but and sort of setting up new institutions, but it's about doing that in a way that recognizes that we need to find a new way of supplying human needs while recognizing human immersion in natural systems. And to me, it's very interesting that a number of these new movements are doing exactly that and paying attention to the natural world as we feed and clothe and ourselves and create energy as well. So, hi, thanks for coming. Thanks, Elizabeth, for setting this up, but don't take the thanks out of my time. I just want to lay out a couple of broad areas here, smartass, as an introduction to sustainable materialism. This is something that I've been thinking about a bit, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. But for me, I'm a political theorist, a social theorist, and for me, part of this is about thinking about developments in environmental activism. What is happening with movements? One of the things that we do is to sort of figure out what it is about some movements that we haven't thought about before. What is innovative about some movements? How is it that what people are doing on the ground don't fit the damn models that we've actually spent some time putting together? So I want to talk about how we think about some of these new movements, or how we might start to think about some of these new movements. But of course, I want to start by describing a few new movements around food, around energy transition, around crafting and making. And then, really briefly, three sort of ways of thinking about or framing these movements. One is that they're a form of resistance to power. Second, it really follows what John is saying, is a new form of post-materialism, a new step from post-materialism. And the third, and it also gets to what folks have been saying, there's a lot of attention, finally, to the relationship of the human and the non-human. It's about the human immersion in the non-human and the relationship between that. So, well, that didn't work, did it? A couple of different kinds of movements that I want to talk about. First, sustainable food or food justice movement. Probably the fastest growing part of the environmental justice movement in the US. For the first time in the US, there's an increasing number of farms. The decrease has shifted, and there's an increasing number of farms. That's led by small farms, by urban farms, by rooftop gardens and farms. Many of the owners are young people, they're recent immigrants, they're women. There's just an incredible amount of energy being put into food production and distribution as a political statement, as a social statement. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of food movements. We don't have to get into all the differences we can in questions, but there's a difference between a slow food movement, which focuses on the ethics of food. It was a rich movement. It was a white movement. But the focus is this sort of self-conscious move away from industrialized food, a self-conscious move away from the way that we've become alienated from the food that we make and eat. And there's this bringing together of that awareness and pleasure and experience and responsibility.
But beyond that, there really has been this food justice movement, and it's not just, again, an industrialized country thing. Gustavo Esteva has been talking about this in Latin America. Of course, Vandana Shiva has been long known for documenting alternative production and circulation of traditional foods. And I don't think it's a coincidence that a place like Detroit is really the leader in the food justice movement in the US, that it's been this reawakening of a response to what has been a food desert in the US. So whether it's based in a response to hunger or food insecurity or food deserts, or a more direct response to sort of thinking about carbon outputs and industrialized agriculture or the loss of traditional foods, the goals, I think, remain the same. It challenges power. It institutionalizes new collective institutions, the kind that we were talking about before, and new sustainable relationships between human communities and the natural communities in which they're immersed. And then, of course, there's a lot of these kinds of movements around community energy. So from just sort of small-scale neighborhood solar installations to the growing network of transition towns to some of the just transition movements to move, for example, Native American communities away from uranium, away from coal, and more towards wind and solar. There's a lot of expansion of attention to the way that energy is produced and distributed, not just consumed. And again, there's a lot of motivations here. There's quite survivalist kind of perspectives on peak oil in the transition town movements. And then there are those that just literally want to take power away from energy companies and embody that power to make power more distributed and dispersed. And then another movement that I've gotten very interested in that has to do with sustainable materialism, and I have to thank my wife and daughter for this push in this direction, has to do with crafting and making and mending. So rather than just protesting sweatshops where workers die or have terrible working conditions, and protesting the increasing disposability of fashion, the alienation of people from technology, and then, of course, the problematic relationship with industrial power and consumerism and various social and environmental problems, a lot of community groups are starting to focus on various forms of community crafting and making. There's a whole new domesticity movement, and there's lots of gender implications here, but it's not just men, or not just women who are doing this, but the resurgence of the interest in canning and sewing and mending, in trashing, sort of turning old materials into new fashions, to upcycling, again, taking old materials and making them into new things. And I do think a lot of this goes beyond gendered roles. There's lots of women taking kitchen waste and making biofuels, for example, not something that you normally did in the kitchen. Again, these movements exemplify this move to reclaim the processes of material life and the flow of materials and power in them. The next, right, so now I want to talk about some ways of sort of thinking about these movements politically and environmentally. And I look at three different ways of framing these movements, though of course they're all sort of interrelated. All have to do with the sort of flow of power and materials through the body and through the community. And first, of course, these are social movements, and they're social movements that arise in response to power. They are embodied responses and counters to existing circulations of power, to existing institutions of power. So Foucault is famous for talking about the way that power circulates. It's not just that somebody is in power, it's that we actually participate in the reproduction of power relationships. And a lot of new movements are focused not just on who has power, but who makes powerful relationships and who makes circulations. So my favorite example of this as an American is a chapter in Michael Pollan's book, Omnivore's Dilemma, where he talks about Americans. Because of the power of the corn industry, Americans have blood that has corn proteins in it that differs from any other people on the planet. Right? So as an American, I physically embody the power of the corn industry in the US. Right? It's just part of my body. It was really interesting that my daughter, when she was born allergic to corn. She was born resistant, and she's kept it up. Yeah. But there's a lot of resistance to this sort of circulation of power through the body. And so there's a lot of agricultural circulations that counter that. Farmers market, community-supported agriculture, urban gardens, that consciously work to replace problematic circulations of power with community-based circulations of power and food. Right? Crafting and making also replace practices and circulations of power that separate us from the creation of the making of basic needs. It gets back to that period of time that we heard about. So from jam to clothes to kids' toys. The idea is to insert oneself, insert communities, insert groups, insert sewing circles into new flows of power that sort of stop the flow, the undesirable flows of power as embedded in industrialized goods, and start new kinds of relationships. The next sort of framing that's important is this is the materialist part. This is the post-materialist part, or the post-post-materialist part. Sorry about that. And this relates to what John was saying. So there's this whole idea that environmentalism is only about values, and it only comes about when you have enough stuff, when you have enough comfort, when you have a certain standard of living, that you can then develop values. Those values then are to be represented by interest groups in a political scheme. This is the political interest in pushing political parties beyond just a focus on wages and taxes and into a concern about women's rights, about gay rights, about environmental conditions. It's about the implementation of values. And Engelhardt has this whole thesis about how Western societies, as they've developed and gotten richer, have developed these sort of post-material practices. Right? And of course, the problem here is that it just doesn't work that way. There's a serious implementation deficit. The values that people have are not being sort of implemented in this way. And there's a frustration with that idea of post-materialism. And so more and more citizens are seeing this lack of implementation. They're frustrated, and so they're developing these new sorts of movements that take the form physically of countering existing practices, that produce alternative practices and flows that pose new challenges to both the sort of flows of mega-circulations of power and also this post-material thesis. And then the last bit, the last way to frame these movements is that they're thoroughly embodied in a conception of sustainability, of resilience, of a changed relationship in the environment in which human beings are immersed. This desire for sustainability has moved from a value to a practice, to change the very material relationship with the non-human realm. So the concern with a lot of movements is with the very flow of food, with the very flow of water, of matter, of energy, of stuff from the natural world through the human body and back out through the natural world, right, to get away from the corn production, for example. And the idea is to recognize the flow of materials and to reconfigure practices that undermine not just sort of human relationships, but the capacity of ecosystems to actually function, of bodies to function, of communities to function. To change those into relationships and flows that enliven, to support, and that minimize the negative impacts on the natural world. And a lot of new institutions are focusing on this, this idea of the material flows of everyday life, to see, as Latour says, the process of human development as neither liberation from nature nor as fall from it, but rather a process of becoming ever more attached and intimate with nature. And that's what I mean, at least, by the environmentalism of everyday life. Now, there are lots of critiques of these movements and lots more examples, and we can talk about that as we get the conversation going.